Good afternoon. I'm Judy Woodward, the History Coordinator of the Ramsey County Library, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you to this first Tuesday Scholar event in our new Spring-Summer series. Our speaker today is Curt Brown on the topic Diverse Stories from Minnesota's Past. Curt Brown writes for the Star Tribune, where he has published more than 400 columns on the history of Minnesota. His most recent book is Minnesota 1918, When Flu, Fire, and War Ravaged the State. Today's program is brought to you through the co-sponsorship of the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute of the University of Minnesota with the financial support of Minnesota's Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund. And we are deeply grateful to both these organizations. Thank you very much. And now let me turn things over to our speaker, Curt Brown, with Diverse Stories from Minnesota's Past. Thank you.
Greetings, everyone, and thank you to Judy Woodruff and Grayson and Carmi and my wife Adele, who's sitting over here, who's going to provide a little tech support as we try to share a screen and share some pictures to help put some faces behind the history we're going to chat about. First of all, I thought I'd tell you a little bit about myself, and then we'll get on. I've picked 5 stories from Minnesota's past that reflect the state's diversity, both stories about women, people of color, Native Americans, and it was tough to come down to the 5 I'm going to talk about, but I hope to talk about 5 minutes on each of those little stories, so there'll be plenty of time for your questions afterwards. Again, like Judy said, my name is Curt Brown. And I moved to Minnesota in 1978 to attend Macalester College, where I was a double major in history and American studies. I also was the editor of the Mac Weekly, and my wife, who's sitting next to me, my wife of 40 years, I should point out, was the ad manager. So we've been doing things together for a long time. I spent more than 30 years in Minnesota's daily journalism scene, first at the Fergus Falls Daily Journal, the Associated Press, the St. Paul Pioneer Press, but most of that time was spent at the Star Tribune in Minneapolis. I covered the Vikings, the legislature, crime, profiles, major projects, just about anything you could name, until 2014, when my wife and I decided to stage second acts, and we moved to a little trout stream near Durango, Colorado. And I'm coming to you live today from the Pine River Library in Bayfield. Our internet was out, which happens when you live in rural America. And the nice people at the library here were nice enough to give me a media room. That's why you see all these sound tiles behind me. Hopefully I'm not going to get shushed by one of the librarians here. When I left the Star Tribune, the editor gave me a freelance contract to write about Minnesota history in the Sunday paper. And we ran a streak of 421 consecutive Sundays with a yarn about Minnesota's past, until just recently they cut me back to every other week for budget reasons. I love writing these stories. It's become really a crowdsourcing of state history, and it's really fed and fueled by reader suggestions, which makes my job easier. I'm the lucky one who gets to tell the tales, and I just love doing it. And I will, at the end of the slides today, we'll share my email and my phone number in case you might have some tips for me. It would be really easy to write all these columns exclusively about white men. After all, white men were the business tycoons, they were the political honchos, they were the war heroes, but they tell less than half the story of Minnesota's past. So I really try to actively seek out stories of people of color, stories of women, kind of to balance that male-dominated narrative that really traces itself all the way back to Alexander Ramsey, whose 5th act as the territorial governor in 1849 was to establish the Minnesota Historical Society. So really, since then, it's been white guys telling the story about other white guys predominantly. So we're going to try today to at least sprinkle in a couple stories on non-white guys. And the first one, and now we're going to attempt the screen sharing photos, is one of the most recent stories that I've written that reflects some of that diversity I was talking about. And it looks like we have the picture that I took of a guy named Gordon Kirk. So I was back in Minnesota last month for a funeral, and I received a tip from Laura Ewan, who is one of the really talented Star Tribune columnists who brings a unique, diverse perspective to the paper as well. And she told me or sent me along a press release about the mayor of St. Paul and other leaders were honoring Gordon Kirk on his 100th birthday last month. And so while I was in town, I decided to try to set up a meeting with this 100-year-old living person in history. You know, so often I write about dead people, which has a value, but it's always a thrill to talk to someone who's alive and for a whole century and had so many stories to tell. He's a longtime resident, Gordy is, of the Rondo neighborhood in St. Paul. And so I called his church kind of just out of the blue, and the nice woman who answered the phone led me to the church's former pastor over in the Hamlin Midway neighborhood, a guy by the name of Grant Abbott, who I knew a little bit from my Minnesota days. And he was nice enough to connect me with Gordon. Now, you might recall that on April Fool's Day, it snowed about 8 inches, fresh snow in Minnesota to welcome us back. And nevertheless, I trudged through the snow on I think it was a Saturday morning, to Mr. Kirk's house on Fuller Avenue in the old Rondo neighborhood. And his power had been out since about midnight from the storm, but he didn't care. He was ready to talk, and he had many great stories to tell. He was born in 1923 in Helena, Montana, of all places. His father worked for the railroads, and that led the family to Seattle in Gordy's younger days. But by age 10, he'd moved to Rondo Avenue in St. Paul, his father's railroad job taking him to St. Paul back in the 1930s during the Great Depression. And Gordy recalled for me the tamale stands and the barber shops and the grocery stores of that historic and culturally rich Rondo neighborhood. And with little bitterness on his part, he talked about how city planners and highway planners could have easily used Pierce Butler Route, which is just a little bit to the north. That was the connection used between the two twin cities for the railroads. But he said it was just cheaper for them to tear up the Black neighborhood and kind of rip apart that culture. And again, it amazed me how little bitterness Gordy showed about what happened to his old neighborhood. Anyway, after he graduated from Marshall High School back in 1942, Gordy did what most of his peers in the time did, or wanted to do at least, and that was join the U.S. and Allied forces fighting the Nazis and Hitler and Mussolini in World War II. He was ready to parachute in and be a soldier to help defend his nation and the world from these horrible leaders in Europe. But the Army told him no thanks because he was African American, because he was Black. He was not welcomed into what was then still a segregated army. So he wound up driving a troop truck for Patton's army in Europe. He was in Normandy right after D-Day, and he remembered how cold the Battle of the Bulge was. He told me about sleeping under his truck because Nazi snipers were firing at them. He said it was cold, but he had his army-issued gloves and boots. And he said the army had given them all sleeping bags too, but he said, quote, the sleeping bags were so thin, you could read a newspaper through them. Gordy then interrupted our interview, and he asked me to feel how cold his hands were. He said that the VA finally began compensating him for these cold, numb hands that he traced us all the way back to the Battle of the Bulge. After years of arguing with the VA, they finally started compensating him. But holding a man's hands who's 100 years old and was at the Battle of the Bulge was a really powerful moment for me. So I wrote about how those hands later held up a handkerchief to cover his nose from the awful smell on the second day after the Dachau concentration camp was liberated. He described how the Jewish people were just skin and bones and shook his head. When he got home from the war, Gordy steered the streetcars through the city of St. Paul after the war. And I don't know if some of you know, but there's an old abandoned tunnel by the St. Paul Cathedral It's all boarded up now, but Gordy recalled how you had to hit that incline as a streetcar driver at just the right speed to get up that incline. And so again, here's a living voice and living memories of a golden era of St. Paul streetcar lines. After about 10 years, and there's another great picture of Gordy. That's from the 1960 NAACP fashion show. And I guess shorts and a white jacket were the fashion of the time. He didn't want to become a bus driver after they got rid of and abandoned the great streetcar lines that way predated our light rail transportation today. So he became a sky cap for Braniff Airlines, which he then shifted over when Braniff went belly up to Northwest Airlines. And he spent 33 years using those hands to lug people's baggage, including Bud Grant, the late coach of the Vikings, and a lot of those players back in the 1970s glory days of the Vikings. He had great perks from his job, including free or very reduced airfare, and was able to attend all 4 of the Vikings Super Bowl games back in the 1970s, thanks to the relationships he made as a sky cap. After those days, he hurt his back and kind of gave up the baggage duties. He went to work for the Veterans Administration. He helped fellow veterans like himself navigate the blizzard and maze of benefits. He told me he's never forgotten the discrimination he faced, after a tolerant childhood. Like I said, he was born up in Montana and spent time in Washington State and St. Paul. So he was kind of shocked when he got on a train to head down to Texas for Army training. And the captain, or the conductor of the train anyway, sent him to the Jim Crow car right behind the engine, a smoke-filled car where he had to stand up. And he remembered walking through the train, which was just half empty. So there were plenty of seats where the white riders and white patrons of the railroad were sitting comfortably. The word he used was pitiful. He said it was pitiful to see Black people not being able to use the same movie theaters or water fountains as Caucasians. So my day spent with Gordy, who hopefully his power came back on soon after I left. He had a great-great-grandson out shoveling the walk for him that day. It was a very powerful day for me, and I think it led to a powerful column. The next story I want to talk about is kind of a two-headed approach about 2 people that came from extremely different backgrounds. And I profiled these 2 people back in February and how their lives intersected in late 1800s in Red Wing, Minnesota, just down the river a little bit, about an hour south of the Twin Cities, of course. Jeremiah Patterson, who's on the right there, was born into slavery in North Carolina in 1860. Julia Bullard Nelson moved to Minnesota from Connecticut in 1957 when she was 15 years old. In 1857, sorry about that. And she went on to study education at at the time, Hamlin College, and became a leading suffragist of her time and a champion of civil rights and voting rights. So in 1897, these 2 opened a butcher shop they named the Equal Rights Meat Market right there on the corner of 5th and Plum Street in Red Wing. Remember, this was back in 1897. Jeremiah was 37 at the time, and Julia was 55. Now, Julia had been married briefly. Her husband, OLLI Nelson, a great Minnesota name, if ever there was one, caught malaria as a soldier down fighting in the Civil War. I think he was in Arkansas, and he died young. He made it back from the war, but he didn't last very long. So his widow, Julia, plunged into teaching Black children after slavery. She started in 1869, and eventually she spent 14 years as a teacher for Black former slaves and children of slaves in both Tennessee and in Texas. Jeremiah Patterson, it just so happens, was one of her prize students. And in 1881, she invited him to come north to Minnesota and run her farm 10 miles south of Red Wing. He was 21 at the time and became a respected horse buyer in Minnesota. Jeremiah thrived in Minnesota in those early days. He went from being Nelson's employee to a renter of the farm within 2 years. And in 1886, he married Verna Gaylord, the white daughter of a locally prominent settler family in Belvedere Township. They raised 9 children, including the eldest, Chester, who became the first Black graduate of Red Wing High School in 1908. The equal rights meat market lasted only a couple years, but it symbolized what was possible for women and African Americans at Red Wing and in Minnesota back at the turn of the century. And there's a shot from, I think it's around 1865, when she was teaching, as I mentioned, the former slaves in Tennessee and Texas. It's amazing we have photographs dating back to that kind of post-Civil War period. The next person I want to talk about, well, I mentioned how I try to make a concerted effort to tell diverse stories in the column and not just the stories of old white guys. But I admit I can do a better job, and especially when it comes to Native American stories. For some reason, I haven't told as many as I should. But last summer, we were back in Minnesota, and I stumbled upon a really good story and a really good photograph here. These columns I write would be nothing. I want to take a little minute to thank the network of tipsters and history buffs and volunteers who kind of, like I mentioned, fuel the whole operation with great ideas. And one of the best tipsters of my Minnesota history column is a guy named Dennis Dvorak, who's an expert on New Prague's past. So he invited me, knowing I was coming back to Minnesota. He emails frequently. He told me about a little cemetery that sits beneath bur, oak, and cedar trees about 3 miles west of Lonsdale in that New Prague area, kind of southwest of the Twin Cities. I'm a big sucker for old cemeteries because they hold so many kind of countless stories. And this one was an old French Catholic cemetery known as the St. Louis Cemetery. The best columns for me are character-driven stories. And so to tell the story of this little cemetery, I picked a character with a great name and a great story. His name was Hercules LaChapelle, and he was a descendant of both Dakota people as well as French Canadians, which was kind of a common mixture back in the 1800s in early Minnesota. He was working as a Mississippi River raftsman when the Civil War erupted back in 1861. So he joined 50 men from Wabasha area who formed Company G of the 5th Minnesota Infantry. Excuse me for a quick drink of water. So Hercules LaChapelle was at 20 key battles of the Civil War, starting in Corinth and all the way up until the last pivotal clash in Nashville 2 years later. Hercules didn't die in the war like 2,500 other Minnesotans, but tuberculosis killed him just 8 weeks after he mustered out of the service at Fort Snelling when the war ended. He'd gone to live with his sister in Wheatland Township in Rice County, which is right near New Prague. Even though his wife Marie and 4 children were still living in Wabasha, where he had been working as a raft guy on the river before the war. Apparently, and we can't prove this, but this is the common belief from Dennis Dvorak and others who've studied it. Apparently, Marie had given birth to another man's child while Hercules was off at the war, and maybe she figured he'd already died. We're not sure of all the details, but he was buried without a marker near his sister's home in that little St. Louis cemetery. Well, fast forward about a year, and last year, a guy from Chesk by the name of Jerry Fritz Anderson, he unearthed a letter from 1880, not 1980, 1880, in Hercules's pension records. And the letter confirmed that he was buried in the little cemetery, the little St. Louis cemetery. So Anderson leads a group called the Native Vets Remembered, a nonprofit organization that aims to bring attention to Native Americans who fought in the Civil War and other wars. And along with a Civil War expert named Ken Flees, they placed a new headstone above Hercules's grave in that formal Civil War headstone. And you can see it right there, Hercules P. LaChapelle. and they had a special reenactment ceremony dressed in period clothing of the blues of the Northern U.S. Army. And they gave him his honor. Granted, it was 150 years after the fact, but it was a nice summer event, a summer moment in history. And for me, I love when history, these old stories that we dust off and tell, merge with something happening today. I think that's what makes the best columns and my favorite ones. I'll give you a little more information about Hercules LaChapelle. He was born in Prairie du Chien, Wisconsin in 1831. His uncle, Theophilus LaChapelle, another great name, was the first Native American to pass the bar in Wisconsin Territory, and he served in Wisconsin's Legislative Assembly in the 1840s. Now, not everyone at that little St. Louis cemetery is as obscure as LaChapelle. Buried right nearby is a guy named Joseph Jack Frazier, who you can see on your screen now. He was a child of both Dakota and Scottish parents, and he became a hunting partner and friend of both Dakota Chief Little Crow and Minnesota's first governor, Henry Sibling. Those, of course, would be the two leaders of the 1862 U.S. Dakota War, and he had befriended both of them. He was known to the Dakota as Ite Maza, which means iron face, and you can kind of see that in this old photograph. Later in life, he had adopted the white man ways, and when that U.S. Dakota War erupted in 1862, he carried a message from Fort Ridgely to Sibley, who was in St. Peter, and to Governor Alexander Ramsey, who was in St. Paul, warning him that an outbreak had exploded out on the western plains of Minnesota. Jack Frazier, again, is buried right there near Hercules, and when he died in 1869, none other than Henry Sibley paid for his tombstone. So I just thought I'd tell you that little graveyard story, and I encourage you to go visit. It's just on a little corner of kind of rolling farmlands where the suburbs meet the exurbs out in just near Lonsdale. I mentioned it was hard to come up with. I've already cheated and told you more than 5 people's stories, but it became really hard. I kind of started with about a dozen possible stories of diverse Minnesota's past, or Minnesota's diverse past. And I'm fascinated. People ask me sometimes, what's your favorite period of Minnesota history? And that 1862 war, to me, is really a fascinating chapter, a bloody and tragic chapter, but a fascinating chapter. You know, some people point out that Abraham Lincoln, originally 303 Dakota fighters were scheduled to be executed after the war. And Lincoln and his lawyers went through the transcripts. Sometimes those trials lasted all of 5 minutes, but they reviewed the transcripts and whittled that list down from 303 doomed Dakota fighters to 38. So some people point out that Abraham Lincoln saved more than 250 Dakota men's lives. When I talk to my Dakota friends and Dakota historians, they'll say, hey, Abraham Lincoln executed our great-grandfathers. Both those perspectives are absolutely accurate, 100%, and history becomes kind of like a prism. So you can look at the same circumstances, but depending on which view you're looking at it, it changes. So I love that 1862 period for its complexity. And so I want to tell you a little bit about 2 women who have fascinating stories from 1862, but didn't make the cut as my top 5. Sorry, it's a little dry out here in Durango. The first woman who you're looking at's name is Sarah Wakefield. And she was the doctor's wife out in western Minnesota when the war broke out. And she was taken hostage by the Dakota for 8 weeks. She ended up writing a book about it in 1866, which you can still find, which is kind of a fascinating account, because unlike everybody else in Minnesota who was outraged that the Native Americans would have the gall to try to win their land back after starvation and broken treaties had marred their relationship with the white settlers who were flooding into the state, Sarah Wakefield actually testified by how well she was treated by the Dakota. She thanked one man particularly named Chaska for defending her from possible murder and rape. Nevertheless, despite her testimony, they hanged Chaska among those 38 in Mankato the day after Christmas in 1862. And in a small world coincidence, one of the librarians here in tiny Bayfield, Colorado, my friend Rachel, who's at a staff meeting just outside the door behind me, she's the great-great-granddaughter of Sarah Wakefield. So my paths intersected, and I wrote a column about Sarah Wakefield a couple months ago. The other woman I want to talk about, his name is Julia Wright, and like Sarah Wakefield, she too, this is her, she's the first adult on the left there. She was really a double victim too of 1862. First, she was taken prisoner, and reportedly she was raped, and she is said to have birthed a mixed race baby that prompted her husband to divorce her after the war. Now, there's no written proof of any of this. The historians at the time kind of shared that story of the mixed race child that came out of her days in captivity. Her husband, there is a divorce file that he won his divorce case in Winona. I think it was in 1865. He claimed that she should have died before letting anybody have his way with her, which was, as appalling as that sounds today, that was kind of the way things were in 1865. We're working on hopefully soon we'll have a sequel to What Happened to Julia Wright. There's a retired high school history teacher down in Walnut Grove, Minnesota, who kind of picked up the slack. When I wrote about her about 6 years ago, I said that history kind of lost track of her after her divorce. Well, he's dug up a lot of new information, and we think there's a divorce file at the Historical Society. I checked down in Winona where the divorce was granted, and they don't keep files that old, but they said they could be at the Historical Society. So it's kind of a needle in a haystack, but hopefully we can find that divorce file, and perhaps it includes his grounds for divorce being that he was outraged that she would allow herself, and I put air quotes there, to be raped. So keep looking in the Sunday Tribune, and hopefully soon we'll have a little update on what happened to her. My email again will go up at the end of these slides. So if you want to help as a volunteer and have some time on your hands and want to go dig through 1865 divorce files, I can point you in the right direction. So I wanted to give kind of a quick nod to both Sarah and Miss Wright, but one of my favorite stories that made my top 5 involved this guy, Cole Younger, and it was a surprising twist. And I've learned in writing 450 of these columns, you have to stay flexible. So originally I set out and did some research on Cole Younger, who of course was a sidekick of Jesse James, who was jailed in Stillwater after the botched bank robbery in Northfield back in 1876. So I was, all planned to write about Cole Younger. There's oodles of material about him and the bank robbery and all that, but I stumbled across an even better story during the research and quickly shifted gears. And I decided to write instead about a young woman with an odd name. Her name was Horace Greeley Perry. So the story goes that Cole Younger had purchased some getaway horses in St. Peter right before the bank robbery, and he was breaking those horses in. He wrote about this in his memoirs, that he met a little girl while he was training those horses in St. Peter. He was 32 at the time, and he was a grizzled, maybe let's go back a slide. He was grizzled, as this picture will show you. That's a pretty grizzled look. This was after his arrest at the bank robbery. You could see he took one to the eye, pretty tough. Anyway, he had been a grizzled Confederate veteran, and little Horace Greeley was only 6 years old when he scooped her up and gave her a ride on his horse during that training exercise. Well, Horace's father was a newspaper man in St. Peter, and he always wanted to name one of his children after his favorite journalist of the era, and that would be the New York Tribune's editor, Horace Greeley. He apparently was hoping for a boy, but decided to stick to the name, even though he had a girl had arrived, and he named her Horace Greeley, after that journalist who, of course, is famous for saying, "Go west, young man." Anyway, that little girl, 6-year-old girl, told the outlaw Cole Younger back in 1876, quote, "I won't always be little. I'm going to be a great big girl and be a newspaper man just like my pa." And this is according to the 1903 autobiography called, the title of it is The Story of Cole Younger by Himself, one of the great titles. And it's available for free. If you Google it, you can read Cole Younger's autobiography. It's right there on the internet. Okay, anyway, after the Northfield bank robbery went awry on September 7th of 1876, a teller and 3 of the bandits were killed that day. Younger was arrested, found guilty of murder and robbery, and sentenced to life at Stillwater State Prison. While he was there with 2 incarcerated brothers of his, they started a jailhouse newspaper called the Prison Mirror. That newspaper exists even today, started by Cole Younger. Jesse and Frank James, by the way, escaped and insisted the rest of their lives that they'd never been in Minnesota. But historians generally agree that they were indeed in Northfield, where the annual September reenactments in a museum still tell the story of the botched bank robbery. Well, fast forward ahead, a decade after that failed bank heist, and a young woman visited the prison in Stillwater with a group one day. And when she signed the register as Horace Greeley Perry, Cole Younger took notice. He said, quote, "I knew there could not be 2 women with such a name in the world." He wrote that in his memoir. And she acknowledged hearing stories about how she'd befriended this outlaw when she was a girl. So just as she had vowed, Perry followed her father and grandfather into the newspaper business and became one of Minnesota's first female journalists. She sold papers on street corners as a kid. She set type at age 12. And eventually she took over the St. Peter Journal in 1891, which meant she was competing with her father, who edited the rival Tribune in St. Peter. She was described in stories about her as vivacious and a crackerjack, and she was in her 20s when she was said to have been the only woman owning and editing a Minnesota newspaper. Here's a quote from an account from 1898 about her life. It said, "Miss Perry is a bright sample of what young womanhood can do in business, and her career as editor and publisher has been marked by wonderful successes." The quote went on to say, "Editorial blood flows in her veins, although in appearance she is a mere schoolgirl." Well, Cole Younger was among her biggest fans, especially when she helped lobby for his release from the Stillwater prison in 1901, a quarter century after that bank robbery. Younger called Perry, quote, "one of the brightest newspaper writers and one of the best and truest women and staunchest friends that a man ever knew. Of all those fighting for his pardon," he said, quote, "none exceeded in devotion the young woman who, as a little tot, had ridden unknowingly with the bandit who was so soon to be exiled for life from all of his kin and friends." Well, after Younger was pardoned, he and Frank James toured with a Wild West show and gave lectures. And Perry joined the team and worked as their publicity agent, according to True West magazine. Perry went on to marry, you can see her husband in this picture, a Mexican mining engineer named Harry Eisenhart in 1906 when she was in her 30s, and she divorced him in 1922. There's all kinds of flowery stories in the archives describing her far-flung adventures. She was in Mexico and Guatemala. She was reporting from Idaho and California. She was befriending tribal chiefs in Oregon and upstate New York. There's few photos or biographies of Perry that still exist, but genealogy sources say she died in Texas in 1958 at the age of 89. And here's one more quote about Horace. Quote, "She has never asked for any favors because of her sex, but has always taken man's work and has drawn a man's pay." This is from the El Paso Herald, reporting in 1906. Quote, "She is as self-possessed and cool as any man who ever took an assignment, and more so than a lot of them. And my last story here, and if for those of you who might have joined my little Zoom talk a year ago, I apologize because I talked about this story a year ago. If you don't remember it or you weren't here last year, that's a good thing. Because I thought I'd just end up my formal remarks today by going back to the beginning in the first of these Minnesota history columns that appeared on October the 5th, 2014. A couple years earlier, a photographer and good friend of mine named David Joels, who recently retired, the two of us were given a tough but really a dream assignment. For the 150th anniversary of the U.S.-Dakota War, we published a 6-part serial narrative called Through the Eyes of, In the Footsteps of Little Crow, it was called. And we even made an ebook out of it, which you can get for, I think, the low price of $2.99. Anyway, if you're a historian, 4 months is not a lot of time. It's just a little speck on the calendar. But for journalists like David and I, 4 months for a project is kind of a rare luxury. And I don't want to talk much about the project, but I do want to talk about a valuable lesson that I learned. We had stopped on our reporting in Litchfield, about 70 miles west of Minneapolis, in Meeker County in central Minnesota. And that's where we found one of my favorite of all the great little county historical society museums that punctuate and dot the state. There's an old Grand Army of the Republic Hall in Litchfield. And if you grab one of the wooden chairs in that museum and flip it over, you'll see they were all signed by Civil War veterans who opened the hall way back in the 1860s. Litchfield and Meeker County was where Little Crow was shot a year after the war. He was with his son picking fruit when someone looking for a bounty that the government was paying didn't even know it was Little Crow, but shot and killed him. So that was part of the story. Anyway, the executive director of the little museum came out to meet the two journalists from Minneapolis, David and myself. But the lesson I learned that day was to look beyond the director who's shaking your hands, because invariably there are some other volunteers, usually women, and older volunteers who know where all the treasure are buried in these little museums and in their town's past. One of the volunteers that day, and I wish I remembered her name, but I don't, she waited until her boss had kind of went through the formal introductions, and then she handed me a big fat folder. And she said, "Here's a story for you when you're done with this war stuff." So I kept that file around, and when this column popped up, I said, here's my chance to tell the story of Albert Van Spence. L. Van Spence was the lamplighter of Litchfield. And the file helped illuminate the story of an African-American who had settled in Litchfield, of all places, after the Civil War, and he worked by lighting the lamps every night in the little town from 1880 all the way to 1904. He would take a horse-drawn wagon and ladder out and clean, fill, and ignite the town's kerosene lamps. He was 5'4" and was described as short, portly, and proud. His genial spirit radiated sunshine, according to one of the yellow newspaper clips in that file that was given to me. He was born into slavery in 1837 Alabama and was conscripted into the Confederate Army, but he ran away and he joined Union forces as a valet for some of the superior officers. Now, we don't know exactly how this former slave and his wife ended up in Litchfield, and that's okay to me, because sometimes history's mysteries don't require all the answers all the time. But we do know there was a guy from Litchfield named Frank Daggett who wound up commanding one of the so-called colored divisions during the Civil War. And his paths must have crossed with Spence's path. Records show that both the men were in Arkansas, but not at the same time. But I can imagine some grim battlefield camp or some post-war setting when Daggett promised Spence a good job was waiting for him in Litchfield if they happened to survive the bloodshed that killed so many others. So Albert Van Spence wound up lighting the lamps and delivering coal, cutting firewood for 50 cents a day, which was enough to buy a house in Litchfield in the 1880s. So I just thought I'd wrap up the formal part of the of the process. That's 5 character-driven, diverse stories about Minnesota's past, not about white guys, but women, Native Americans, and African Americans. And I think they clearly illuminate our state's past, as well as the important stories we sometimes do have to tell about those white businessmen and politicians and war heroes. So that gets us to the end of, again, my formal comments, and there's plenty of time for questions. I see we have a couple in the Q&A, and Judy's going to come back and be our conduit here. And fire away. I'm ready.
All right, that sounds good. You might want to stop sharing your screen.
Yeah, that's true. Good idea.
Before we start the questions, well, I'll say to the audience, now's your turn. We've heard of several stories here, and what questions do you have for Curt Brown? You can put them in the Q&A line at this point, and I'll read them to you. Before we get started with the questions in the Q&A line, though, I'm going to ask a question of my own. I want to know more about your research methods, particularly when you got started, because now it sounds like people know you and, you know, they kind of think of you as a place to send information. But when you started this project, how did you, find the stories and do the research?
Well, it really was almost an afterthought, Judy. The first column we did about Van Spence, we put a little tagline on the end of it. We called it a tagline kind of at the end that said, if you have any ideas or suggestions for this column, go ahead and email mnhistory@startribune.com, which magically somehow weaves its way into my Gmail box. And my wife, Adele, who's patiently enduring another one of these talks, that it's almost like these little gift wrap packages parachute down, and people tell me their family history or about some old relic they found or some old artifact. And really, the hard part is to, well, what am I going to write about this week? And that seldom ever happens because I don't get inundated with reader suggestions, which is a good thing. But 2 or 3 times a week, I'll get some fascinating email that pops in. I keep a little growing list. As to your question about the research, people wonder somehow, how can you write this column about Minnesota history from 1,700 miles away in Durango, Colorado? And it's really easier than I thought it would be. I mean, it does help that we make trips back to Minnesota occasionally. But first of all, there's newspaper archives, which now, give you just this treasure trove of information. The Historical Society website is another source that's full. I pay for Ancestry.com, which is amazing. The other day I put my mother's name in there and her high school yearbook picture popped up. So those are the three three legs of the stool that start my research. But I try to always quote someone or talk to someone, either a descendant or someone who's doing research. The column I just sent in for this Sunday's paper involves a 17-year-old sophomore in high school who won a prestigious honor. He had to research a silent hero, they call him, from World War II, someone from Minnesota. And he picked a guy and is doing the research and will go to Hawaii next month to present his research at the memorial in Honolulu. So it's really fun when you can, like I said, connect something going on today with these ancient stories of the past instead of just telling the story of some long since dead person. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I try.
It's very interesting. Do you ever feel like you have to verify anything? Are you ever worried about publishing some, legendary but not necessarily true family story?
A couple of sources, and I try to just tell readers, here where I got the information. I'm not trying to pretend that I've dug all this stuff up myself. I usually point to the experts who led me to the story. In these 450 columns that we did, I'll tell you one nightmare scenario. Someone had sent me a story about an early guy on the park board in Minneapolis, and he was a big bike enthusiast back in the 1880s and 1890s, and he was older than most of the bike riders, but he won some big bike race around Lake Nokomis, and it was kind of a puff piece, and we had a nice picture of him on his 1880s bicycle. Well, then someone reached out and said, hey, you did a good job for what you knew, but if you Google his name and the word incest. So it ended up, this guy had done 70 years for incest in his own family. So we came back quick.
Oh,
And
Lord.
said, remember that nice story we told you about last week about this guy who rode his bike?
Mhm.
It wasn't such a nice story. So we tried to
Yeah,
get the record straight. So there always is, we keep learning. And that's what's great about history.
yeah.
Learning the stories get deeper and richer as we do the research.
And while we're on the subject of research, you had said that you were going to give people your email address. I'll put it in the chat or in the in the chat line. If you want to give it to me, I'm sure you're always looking for tips, and I'd be glad to type in
Throw it
your
up in
email.
a screen share. That's okay. We're
Mhm.
gonna throw it up there for a few minutes. People can jot it down. It's easy enough to remember. mnhistory@startribune.com. Or I'll give out my personal email, which is curtbrown1960 @gmail. That's the year I was born. And my phone
Okay.
is about to pop up on your screen. It's coming. But meanwhile, what else do people want to know?
All right. Well, while we're working on that, let's see. Could you speak to the importance of local newspapers, especially now? I don't know if that's totally in the realm of Minnesota history, but this person would really like to hear you talk about that.
Well, it is sad to be part. We joke sometimes in our business that we're kind of like the people who were in the horseshoe business back in 1899, saying, "Oh, these cars are never going to be too big of a deal." The Star Tribune remains a strong and profitable newspaper. So I'm thankful for my, more than 30 years of a relationship with the newspaper. But in my little town of Durango, Colorado, which coincidentally is owned by a guy named Richard Ballantyne, whose grandfather, John Coles, owned the Star Tribune back in its glory days. But
Oh,
the paper here, when I moved here 9 years ago, was 7 days a week, full of good local news. I think you're missing the little blue button. Anyway, now it's down to 3 days a week, which is kind of a tragic thing. And, I think there'll always be a room of people like me and my colleagues at the Star Tribune who have to figure out what's going on and what's an interesting story to share with the community. The way we deliver it obviously has changed. And from the, gas guzzling delivery trucks and the old inky presses, now it's this clean internet way of delivering the news.
mm.
And we gave it away for so many years for free. And now we're tightening up the firewalls and trying to make money off the internet. And some people don't like that. Here we go. We're going to have the phone number
Uh,
pop soon. So
almost this isn't totally necessary because I
there we
have
go.
put it I've also put your email address in the chat line, so it's there for everyone, and it can just stay in the chat line.
People can jot down my phone number too. I'm kind of lonely
Okay.
in rural America, so I would love to hear from people.
Right.
Yeah, newspapers to me can't get more important. I still read the Star Tribune on my phone every morning and the Pioneer Press, and the 3 days a week that the Durango Herald comes out. I just think it's vital to have people paying attention to what's going on and share that news whether it's good or bad to the people of a community. So thanks for that question.
So the questioner asks, where do you live now? And I think you've answered that question, but maybe I'll add to that. Have you had any interest in doing, historical episodes from the history of Durango? Are you thinking of expanding your scope at all?
Yeah, well, I do live down in the Four Corners area, so we're closer to Albuquerque, New Mexico, than we are to Denver, down in that Four Corners region of the country. And I have branched out a little bit.
Mhm.
I learned that in our little town of Bayfield, again, population 2,000, 20 miles east of Durango, there was a thriving and very active Ku Klux Klan chapter back in the 1920s. And the story goes, I think it was in the 80s, there was a guy restoring some apartments above an old garage, and he knocked a wall out and found this treasure trunk that he thought was going to be filled with money and would make him rich. But instead, it was all the KKK records, uniforms, outfits, caps, hoods, all that stuff, which he then realized really wasn't worth very much. So he donated it to the local Fort Lewis College here that has a great archive called the Center for Southwest Studies. So we went in there and kind of combed through the records and put together a little slideshow and talk that we've given a few times on the KKK in 1920s Bayfield,
Yeah.
Colorado. And people,
Mhm.
it's kind of an ugly chapter, and a lot of people on the local heritage board didn't want to touch it, wanted nothing to do with it. But other
Yeah.
people thought, we're not responsible for the sins of our grandparents. So it sparked kind of an interesting discussion. And the last time we did the talk, which was right behind me in this library, someone stood up and said, there's 3 KKK members right now standing in this room. And if they were there, they behaved well. So we are trying to do a little
Wow.
local history.
Yeah.
I'm still
On,
deeply connected to Minnesota.
on things like the KKK, for example, when you do research, and I've always wondered this, particularly about the KKK of the 1920s, do you ever find membership lists?
Yeah,
Because
but
the people who were members then have grandchildren who are still alive today, right?
that's what played out here in Bayfield. My friend Joanne
Uh-huh.
McCoy, who's in her 80s and is, was born and raised here. She lived in Denver briefly, but she's basically spent her whole life here. So we went together to go through the records, and she said, oh, this guy drove the school bus, and this guy was the father of this school teacher.
Yeah.
So she knew a lot of the names. And, our little heritage society that I volunteer with, they were a little apprehensive about digging this stuff up because they kind of rely on
Mhm.
the $40 annual dues from some of these families
Yeah.
that are
Yeah.
still living in the
Hmm.
valley. And it's kind of ironic because here are these guys who put on hoods to protect their identity in the 1920s. Now, with a couple keystrokes on your laptop, you can find out the whole list of Bayfield's KKK membership rolls. So
Wow. Yeah.
they didn't see
Yeah.
that coming, but they didn't know what was coming down the future.
Sure. Yeah. All right. Question about your book, In the Footsteps of Little Crow. I don't have a Kindle, this person says. Is there any other way to obtain a copy of it? It's not on Audible either. Do you know, was it printed at any point?
Sadly, it wasn't. I mean, the original newspaper, so it was
Mhm.
basically a repackaging effort as the newspaper was looking for, as it always is, new revenue streams. So the story itself was a 6-part series that ran 6 days in a row in August of 2012. So a lot of libraries will have either on microfilm or the actual newspapers. I know the Historical Society Library for sure would have the actual hard copy
Yes.
papers.
Mhm.
And on the internet, we kind of repackaged it into this little ebook format that you should be
Okay.
able to find on Amazon. I was on my Amazon page recently, and you can find In the Footsteps of Little Crow by Curt Brown and David Joels. So it shouldn't be
But
too,
only as an ebook, right?
yeah, only as an ebook on the internet.
Okay.
Um,
Yeah.
the Star Tribune archives, which you have to pay for. Sometimes they open it up for free. You can
Uh-huh.
dig it up that way too, again, from August 2012. So it takes a little effort, but
Mhm.
it's out there somewhere, but they never did kind of publish it as a standalone. And
Sure.
we argued with them that it could be used in schools and it would have been a good
Mhm.
kind of community service, but that fell on deaf ears, I'm afraid.
Yeah. Okay. So to answer the question, which was, I think it is only available as an ebook, but there you might be able to get it through archives of the Star Tribune as well. All right. And now, let's see. Now a sort of a proposition, I think, for someone that you might consider writing about. This person says, Anoka has honored Anna Arnold Hedgeman, one of the earliest Negro, which is what they were known as, graduates of Anoka High in 1918, who became the first Black student at Hamlin and ended up on the East Coast. She became a YWCA executive and a prominent figure in the NAACP, who was on the planning committee for the 1963 March on Washington. Have you written about her, or would you be interested in writing about her if you haven't?
I'm proud to say, and I love when these suggestions come up, that I've
Uh-huh.
done that story already.
Oh,
I'm not sure
okay.
where in the last 9 years and 450
Uh-huh.
counts, but I did write about her. And if the
Mhm.
questioner wants to send me an email, I'll happily send a PDF of my story about her. Yeah, that was a fun, diverse story from Anoka's passed and Minnesota's passed. So I think it was about 5 years ago. I could easily put my fingers on it. And I know people, a lot of times I'll send them a link to these stories that have run, and they'll get frustrated because if they're not a paying subscriber, they run into a firewall. And for those people, if you send me an email, I can kind of skirt the rules and make it a PDF and send you an email. So.
And I should point out in this context that the library, of course, has access to the Star Tribune archives, and we can always send you, because we are paying for a subscription that allows us to share past stories. So you can always ask at the library for the story as well.
So I hate to say been there, done that, but I've been there, done that.
No, base has been covered is what you want to say. Let's see, we do have more time. And so if there are other questions, type them in now, because we want to, give you a chance to ask questions for our speaker, Curt Brown. While we're waiting to see if there are other questions, I'll ask you something that I've wondered about. Are there ever stories that you come across that for one reason or another, you feel that you just can't publish them at that particular time? Maybe there are living people whose reputations would be injured or something like that. Do you ever sort of put stories away for later?
I do. And in fact, like I mentioned, this Julia Wright story, we're trying to come up with some new sequel material. But the one story that kind of haunts me, that I haven't done a column about, but I covered extensively when I was back on the Daily Beat, was the story of Sarah Jane Olson. Of course, people might remember she was the soccer mom in St. Paul who suddenly was arrested by the FBI for her part in the Siboney's Liberation Army that was out in the 1970s, attempted to blow up a police car in front of an IHOP restaurant in Los Angeles. And I covered her bail hearing. In fact, our kids had gone to the same Spanish immersion school, the Adams Spanish Immersion School. And so that one became really complex because over the course of covering it, I got to know her husband, who's a doctor in St. Paul. He insists, of course, he knew nothing about his wife's past, which I can't question. I have a feeling he was had to say that, but I mean, it's a really complex and great story. And it was really the first time I kind of saw how divided our nation's become and polarized, because, people either said, hey, she's lived a good life. She got caught up as a youth back in a turbulent time and kind of understood her role. Others called her a terrorist of her time that should go off to jail. Of course, she did spend, I think it was 4 or 5 years in prison in California. Now she's out back and leading a quiet life. And one of the editors at the paper, I think it was on the 10th year anniversary of her release, sent me over to her house to, go do a story about the 10th anniversary of Sarah Jane Olson's arrest. And she was actually at the food shelf at her church doing good things. And I had coffee with her husband. And, I just kind of made the decision to myself that here's a woman who has had a miraculous and extraordinary story to tell, but she doesn't want to tell it in the newspaper. And she's paid her debt, she's paid her time, she spent time in prison. And if she wants to just garden in her backyard quietly without the without the pressure of a daily newspaper story, I kind of thought, well, I'll grant her wish and leave her alone. And another story point out.
I'm just gonna
go ahead.
Before we leave Sarah Jane Olson, what was her name at the time of the SLA?
Her name was Kathleen Solaya.
Kathleen Solaya.
She was on the wanted list. So, I mean, that's a great story that I haven't touched, kind of in respect for her privacy. And another one I would throw out there was actually the first story I ever covered in Minnesota. I was a young AP reporter just out of McAllister, and I had the day off. And my boss, the bureau chief at the AP office in Minneapolis, said, you ought to go out to Ruthven, Minnesota. 2 bankers were shot and killed, and people might remember this story from 1983. And a guy named James Jenkins and his son were wanted in this ambush slaying of these 2 rural bankers. And I headed out there with my notebook in hand, and all the radio reports on WCCO said authorities were searching for a father and a son in a white pickup truck. Well,
Yeah.
of course, every vehicle I passed on my drive was a father and a son in a white pickup. And I was like, what do I do? Do I follow them?
Yeah.
So I went to the bank where there was a handwritten sign that said, bank closed. And another guy pulled up that day and said, I said, Curt Brown, AP, did you know these bankers? And he said, Toby is my son. What happened? And I said, well, I don't know what happened, but according to the radio, they were ambushed. And he gave me this quote about, he said, if Toby had his gun, it would have been a different story because Toby was the best shot walking. So anyway,
Wow.
I sent that quote and other information
Mhm.
to the AP office in New York. This quickly became a national story. And as I asked around the little town of Ruthven out on the western border, I found out this wasn't like your run-of-the-mill struggling farmer in the farm crisis of the early 80s. This was kind of a town whack job, and he maybe had 10 acres of a farm, and he got divorced, and his wife took their daughter, and he got this son who he was kind of brainwashing, saying that the only reason our family is split up because these two bankers and they were the problem. And we need to get revenge, and you need to learn how to shoot a gun. And so he kind of brainwashed his kid. Anyway, during the trial that I covered, they exhumed the old man's body. Oh, I should say that the two of them made it to Paducah, Texas, where James Jenkins committed suicide and the kid turned himself in. He was only 18 at the time. Yeah. He was sentenced to life in prison because they exhumed the body of his father and proved that his tunnel vision in his eyes made it impossible to shoot anyone from 150 yards away. So it had to be the son. Well, anyway, flash forward more than 30 years, and Tom Fable, who was the prosecutor for the Attorney General's office, was helping to get Stephen Jenkins, the young man caught up in this brainwashing crime and murder, out of prison. And I said, wow, that's a great story. Here you are, the prosecutor, and you're helping get this guy out of jail. Well, he said, it is a great story, but you can't write about it because the last thing Stephen Jenkins needs when he gets out, is publicity. He needs to quietly go about his life. And he learned the skills of upholstery and carpentry in prison and is out. And I've had dinner with him since his release. But that was another story that, for reasons would have been a great story. Books have been written about it. In fact, I learned about how the media can distort things because I told you about, we were following the story and he went down to the Worthington Daily Globe office to file the next story. And the old grizzled wire editor at the Worthington Daily Globe said, hey, kid, you want to see your name on the national A wire? And I was like, sure. And I had told him, this is not the run-of-the-mill farmer. He was the town nutcase. And the lead that they had rewritten on my story said, in a symptom of America's ailing farm economy, two frustrated farmer father and son, took their frustrations on these two bankers. I was like, that's not the story. That's not what I called in. They said, well, do you want to be national wire or not? So.
Yeah. Okay, let's move on. We got a question about Horace Greeley Perry. What a wonderful name. Was there a book written on Horace Greeley Perry? Do you have a title if there was a book?
There's not, but I would lead people, like I mentioned, to the autobiography of Cole Younger by himself, it's called, because that's where I got most of the information about her. There's lots of old newspaper kind of profiles about her, but I couldn't even find a good picture besides the one we shared, which was kind of a sketch from the old turn of the last century newspapers. And that's what really surprised me. Here I am going, oh, a Cole Younger story, that'll be an easy column. And, there's so much. Sometimes the hard part of these columns is being kind of the gatekeeper of what gets in. I get 850 words if I'm lucky. So to boil down a huge life like Cole Younger gets tough. But, I was reading his memoir. I'm like, wow, he met this little girl and then she helped him get out of jail and became his publicist. And who was this woman? And she became far more interesting than, the old botched bank robber Younger. So there was no book as far as I can tell. But Cole
Mhm.
Younger's book tells the story and is kind of a interesting read. And she probably helped him ghostwrite it, I'm guessing.
Probably, yeah. I've put the title of Cole Younger's autobiography by himself. I put it in the chat line for anybody who wants to follow up on this. And then the follow-up question, what is the name of Sarah Wakefield's book? Is there a book on Sarah Wakefield?
There is, and I'm trying to remember it. I think it's called 6 Weeks in Indian Teepees. There's 2 books, and sadly, the woman who she kind of did an annotated version of Sarah Wakefield's book with kind of an introduction and context. And she recently passed away. I think she was a professor of history in Alaska, of all places. So she came up with one book, it is Sarah Wakefield's book from 1866 called 6 Weeks in Indian Teepees.
Mhm.
And then she did another book. There was several chapters, and one of the chapters was her kind of research and scholarly look at the life of Sarah Wakefield. And I can't remember her
I
name.
think it was actually 6 weeks in the Sioux
Yeah,
teepees. I just
exactly. That's the one.
here, let me just I just Googled it. So
I can see.
okay. So if anyone wants to follow up on that, I don't know if the library owns that book.
Also, Judy, I
but
should point out that recently in our
uh-huh.
section, which is one of my favorite parts of the Star Tribune, I think we're one of the only newspapers left in the country that has 2 pages dedicated to book reviews on Sunday. It's kind of a miracle. But just recently, it surprised me to read a historical novel about Sarah Wakefield's life has just been published, and we did a review about it. You know, for my column, I have to kind of steer away from historical fiction because we try to keep it just to the facts as much as we can. So when someone says, hey, I wrote a fictional novel kind of based on this chapter in Minnesota history, I'm like, well, that doesn't really work for me. But in this case, it was just in the last month or 2 that we had a book review about a historical novel based on the life of Sarah Wakefield. So if people
Do you
like,
remember the title of that?
I don't, I can try to find it.
Okay. All
Oh,
right. Well, I don't, let's see, was it a stricken field? I'm trying to do research. No, that's pretty old. That's from 2011. All right. Well, we'll check on that. And if we have more information, or maybe one of the people in the audience knows it and can just,
sounds like a great book. I'm going to type it in and see if I can find
yeah.
it.
Well, why don't you let us do that? And I'm going to ask you another question.
Here it is. It's called The Lost Wife by Susanna Moore. I
The
found it.
Lost Wife?
Yeah. By Susanna Moore. So, and her
Like
great
so?
great granddaughter, well, like I told you, my friend Rachel Jenkin is at a meeting in the same library
Uh-huh.
that come to you now. So she's the one who
Yep.
gave that book 6 Weeks in Sioux Teepees. And
Okay.
another book. So there are definitely
Mhm.
books out there about Sarah Wakefield. And Julia Wright, who I talked about, there's really been nothing written. That's why it's exciting that this retired
Mhm.
history teacher from Walnut Grove, a
Hmm.
famous Minnesota town from Laura Ingalls Wilder fame, is digging
Right.
all kinds of good stuff. So maybe there's a book in there for somebody.
Okay. All right. Now let's change subjects a little bit. Here we go is a question about Osseo. Osseo is having its sesquicentennial in 2025. Do you have ideas for us to work on and or suggestions for sources which we could use for our Story of Osseo project?
Well, the one thing that jumps into my mind, first of all, 2025 is a long way away. Hopefully, I'll still be writing these columns. But I'm sure a lot of our viewers, our Zoom participants today, know the name Kevin Kling, who's a good friend of mine, a great storyteller, and a great fan of history, who's from Osseo, the Maple Grove, Osseo area. And I'm sure he would be a font of information about the early days of Osseo. I know I've done a couple of columns on some founders and stuff on the time. And yeah, a lot of Minnesota towns like Osseo will be hitting the big, 150th anniversaries coming up. But I would search Kevin Kling's brain, which is full of great stories and great storytelling. And he's an Osseo native, so he might have a good idea of, kind of where to go and where
Oh,
to look.
that's a good idea. Yeah. Okay. You mentioned our polarized nation, says this person. If you were writing the stories of people who represent opposite political positions, what events or experiences might you see which began or brought about this distinctive difference in attitudes?
Yeah, well, and like I pointed out earlier in this talk, a couple things like
Mhm.
way back in that 1862 war, there are so many different ways of looking at that situation. There's a whole group of descendants of white settlers from the New Ulm area, and
Yeah.
they feel, and I think they have an argument they can make, is that it's kind of, as history has evolved and the narrative of that war has changed from, outrageous Native Americans, attack savagely the poor white farmers,
Yeah.
to starving Indians who were lied to and cheated to, seek revenge during the Civil War.
Mhm.
And the whole Lincoln's role, did he save 250 or did he, execute 38 grandparents?
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
think, that's one of those things. It's the same set of facts and people have very different opinions. And that white settler group makes a point that their great grandparents, have kind of been forgotten. It's turned into it was the army against the Dakota.
Mhm.
And meanwhile, there were guys who had just arrived from Germany or were out, cutting grass in the field, that didn't know about all these treaties and all this stuff. They were just trying to make for a better life. And many were, beheaded and savagely attacked when the war broke
Mhm.
out.
Yeah.
To just say that, then you missed the whole point of what had happened in the Indians to get to that point. So it becomes confusing. And in a more modern context, that Sarah Jane Olsen story that I pointed out, some people were like, she should have been, she could have killed a cop when his bomb failed to go off in front of the IHOP parking lot of the squad car that was rigged under the squad car. Had it gone off, she would have, been implicated in a murder of police officers. So some people take that very seriously, that she was a terrorist, just like an Al Qaeda member. Other people say, hey, she was a kid wrapped up in the history of her times,
Mhm.
so I mean, I think the Vietnam War, that whole Sarah Jane Olsen kind of was a litmus test for where you stood, or when looking
Yeah.
at the Vietnam
Yeah.
War, were you
Mhm.
afraid of communism and thought America was doing the right thing as the global police, or did you think it was a foolish and foolhardy defeat in the making? So, yeah, I think Vietnam is ripe for. I mean, I remember growing up, and my older brother, who's now in his 70s, having heated debates with my father about the Vietnam War. And that certainly was a cleaving moment in our more recent American history.
Yeah. Do you have any stories about, with Minnesota roots about the Vietnam War, or
I've
about that
written a few
cleavage?
stories, and there are some great oral histories on my list of stories.
Mhm.
Hope to get to soon. There's
Mhm.
some great oral histories of Vietnam vets, and I've written a couple of those Vietnam stories. It seems like, oh, the Vietnam War, that was just yesterday. That happened in my
Yeah.
lifetime compared to World War I and the Civil War and the U.S. Dakota War. But now the Vietnam War, those veterans are becoming lost more and more every day. They're all
Mm.
getting up there in age, so it is important that we capture
Yeah.
these stories.
Yeah. All right. Questioner says, how long did you live in Minnesota?
I lived in Minnesota, like my wife points out. She was here longer than I was, but I came in
Okay.
1978 to go to McAllister College
Mhm.
till 2004. So I think that's 36 winters. 2014 is when we left.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's 36 winters. So that's more than a third of a century. My wife,
What are the biggest changes? What changes what changes strike you in those 36 years?
well, I think what strikes me the most is the lack of changes. I still think
Mm.
I drove up to Ely and the Boundary Waters last year. A lot of these small towns really haven't changed that much. I mean, I think a lot of the thriving little downtowns, sadly, have
Mhm.
gone the way of the Walmarts and the big superstores out on the edge of town. So I guess that would be one of the
Mhm.
sad. But like I said, I started my newspaper days at the Fergus Falls Daily Journal, and I think
Mhm.
that was in the early 80s. If you go back to Fergus Falls today, it's not that much different. I mean,
Mhm.
it's come and
Yeah.
gone in some ways. I mean, I think, the deinstitutionalization of mental health is a huge change that's come
Yeah.
down.
Yeah.
Fergus Falls, that's what got me thinking, had that huge state hospital, and they were all around the state. We basically locked up people who had mental health issues. And then we decided that wasn't the right way to go. And we unleashed that population who continues to struggle with homelessness and violence. So, I think that's one of the big changes that stands out for me.
Yeah. All right. And now we have another suggestion, or maybe you've already written about early Chinese American restaurant and laundry operators in Minnesota. This person says Louis Fong had a hotel and restaurant in Virginia on the Mesabi Range for several years around 1905. And of course, there was Joe Huey in Duluth for much of the first half of the 20th century. Have you done anything about Chinese Americans in Minnesota?
I've done more about Japanese Americans. I think is a fascinating story that, while people were getting interned, which is a nice word, they were locked up and during World War II, Asian Americans and Japanese Americans after Pearl Harbor. Meanwhile, back in Minnesota at Fort Snelling, there was a thriving, kind of secretive at the time, military intelligence service where they were smart enough to realize some of these Japanese Americans or children of Japanese Americans, could be a great help in cracking codes and reading, doing intelligence work. And so I've done a bunch of stories on that, less about Chinese. But that question kind of reminds me of what's changed in Minnesota, which you asked a couple of seconds ago. And really the diversity in Minnesota is a huge change. If you look, I've done a bunch of stories on the Hmong community, the thriving Hmong community in St. Paul that came about after Hmong soldiers helped the U.S. military in the Vietnam War. The Somali population, is a thriving part of Minneapolis culture. I remember once as a reporter, when I'm forgetting her name, the first state legislature, Mi Mua was the first Hmong American elected to the state legislature. And I still remember it was a Monday night on the east side of St. Paul, and I was kind of groaning and complaining that I had to work on a Monday night. And Randy Kelly had become the mayor, so his seat at the legislature was vacated. So there was a DFL endorsing meeting going on in a school on the east side. And so I went in there and was blown away because there were hundreds of Hmong Americans waving little flags from grandmothers to kids, and they were chanting, "Mi Mua, Mi Mua." Well, it ended up because they weren't officially delegates and in the party system, she couldn't get the DFL endorsement, but she blocked anyone else from getting it and quickly rose in popularity and was elected. And, those were those little turning point moments that shine about the new diversity in Minnesota. It's not your grandparents' Minnesota, but it's, I would argue, a far more fascinating mixture than it used to be.
Sure. We've got about 10 minutes left, and we do have time for additional questions. If someone in the audience has another question, now's your chance. Type it in. I'll ask a question. I love the names of, what was it, Hercule de la Chapelle and his father, Theophile. But I was kind of wondering, because I know of other Native Americans are in this area with French names. Could you talk a little bit more about that sort of French connection? Why did they have French names as opposed to Native American names?
Well, I think it's fascinating. The whole kind of development in Minnesota came because of fashion. People wanted those big hats, those big stovepipe hats made with beaver felts. And that's kind of what got white people and European people flooding into the rivers and the forests of northern Minnesota, was to catch beavers and sell beaver pelts to make these hats that were so popular in Paris, France. I mean, without that fashion quirk, who knows what would have happened in Minnesota history. So if you were an early trader and you were going out to hunt for beaver pelts or trading Native Americans who knew where the beavers were and how to catch them, and Henry Sibley was among those who took Dakota wives and had Dakota children with these Dakota wives. So the quick way, if you were a white trapper or a white trader, to kind of grace yourself with the Ojibwe and Dakota people who were living here at the time, was to marry one of their daughters. And the closer she was to a chief's family, the higher your prestige would be. So a lot of those guys came from Canada, French Canadians, took themselves Dakota wives, produced Dakota children, and that's where you get the French names from.
Sure. Okay, well, I think we've reached the end of our questions and we're almost out of time. So I'm going to say thank you very much to Curt Brown. I want to thank our behind the scenes tech people. That would be Grayson, my partner from OLLI. And also I'd like to say thank you to Adele Brown, who is the right, our corresponding, right there she is. Thank you very much, Adele, for making this technically possible. And of course, thanks very much to our audience who came up with all those great questions. Next week, we'll be back, and I hope you will all return when we welcome Professor Alfred Marcus from the U of Minnesota on the topic, When a Nation Grows Old, the Implications of Global Demographics. But for right now, I'm going to say thank you very much and goodbye, everyone.
Thanks, Judy.